Lieberman. I'm the Consulting and Program Support Director at the Safe Routes Partnership. Welcome to our virtual meeting today on dropping enforcement from the 6 E's of the Safe Routes to School framework. We wanted to hold this virtual Zoom because we know there's been a lot of conversations on the Safe Routes to School Google group or listserv, on social media, and with our staff and amongst groups, many of you who are in this room, about dropping enforcement from Safe Routes to School and what that looks like and for your programs going forward. But we know that some people haven't been able to have the opportunity to have those conversations and to hear from us. So we wanted to give everyone the opportunity to do that today. So if you're not familiar with our organization, we are a national nonprofit organization working to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and also in everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. I'm joined by a number of my colleagues today. You'll meet them in the breakout groups. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping before we get started. Everybody, all the participants are muted right now during the main presentation. Once you get into your small groups, you can feel free to unmute yourself. You can also feel free to share your video during the small groups, or feel free to hide it if you're more comfortable with that. Let's see what else. You can also, if you're having problems with audio, I would recommend trying to switch over to the phone. We are going to have the chat box open, and if you have any questions about the presentation or problems with Zoom, go ahead and enter them into the chat box. And we'll have a brief period for Q&A related to clarifying questions about the presentation right after that. We will be using the breakout rooms feature later, but I'll cover the logistics for that when we get to it. And just to let you know that we are going to record the main presentation today. We're not going to be recording the breakout groups, but just know that we are recording this main presentation. We'll be sharing it online for others to see. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to start with a presentation by my colleague, Marissa Jones. Marissa is the Policy and Partnerships Director of the Safe Routes Partnership. She's going to be talking about what we mean by safe, what we've seen as the traditional role of police in Safe Routes to School, why policing and enforcement can be problematic, talk about alternatives to policing and enforcement, talk about the change, what the difficulty is and the opportunities we have. Then, as I mentioned, we'll have a brief time for Q&A. And then we'll move into our smaller group discussions. And we have some questions for everybody to think about and to guide the discussion. And then that'll be about 25 minutes. And then we will wrap up at the end just by coming back together and talking a bit about logistical next steps. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marissa for the presentation.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking some time to be with us today to talk and explore a little bit more about this important topic. So I want to start by sharing that our organization has always held a broad definition of the term safe. For years, we have promoted Safe Routes to School policy and programming that reflects all of these goals. We don't want kids injured or killed as a result of traffic violence, that we don't want them to be bullied or harassed on the way to school, and certainly we don't want them to be victim to physical violence, threats, or intimidation. You can view countless resources on our website, tweet chats, written reports. We've partnered with organizations that really lead on these topics, and so it's just important to note that our definition of safety has always been fairly broad. And maybe most importantly is that in addition to all of those things that we're trying to avoid, a key goal of Safe Routes to School is to promote healthy, holistic, thriving communities. So we want kids to arrive at school ready to learn. We want them to be able to run and skip and hop and ride their bikes in their communities in their full expressions of selves. We want more than them just not being killed or hurt or harassed on the way to school. We want kids to be joyful and enjoy their childhoods. So let's talk a little bit about the traditional role of police law enforcement in Safe Routes to School. In many places, police actually don't have a huge role in Safe Routes to School. And in fact, only 26% of programs have reported involvement with police law enforcement and all. And the roles that they typically play are that they're often a partner at the table because it's been recommended that that is the case. There aren't too many places across the country where police are the critical foundation for safe routes to school programs. And in places where they do play more significant roles, it appears that it's because of the way that funding flows. And so some of the key roles that programs have told us that police are involved in are educating students about traffic safety, closing streets for temporary installations and events, conducting speed surveys, and targeted enforcement of traffic laws. It's really important for us to interrogate how effective police law enforcement are as part of safe routes to school. And I will just say that research on the efficacy of traffic enforcement is very difficult to, not very specifically focused on schools. So much of the research that we found is focused on drunk driving enforcement, texting and driving enforcement, and often includes highways. And so one of the studies that we found that was most related to efficacy of police law enforcement and schools is a research study conducted by the Department of Justice, Office of Community-Oriented Policing on traffic mitigation around schools. And this report states that law enforcement responses alone are seldom effective in reducing or solving the problem. And they go through and identify what is effective and what has limited effectiveness. And they state that responses with limited effectiveness include enhancing enforcement of existing traffic laws and increasing traffic fines. Oh, Michelle, I think we lost the presentation. Oh no, Michelle just got kicked out of Zoom. Well, y'all give me one moment and I'm gonna pull up the presentation. Sorry.
I'm back. Sorry, that was a 2-second. There we go.
So we're on slide 7, Michelle. Okay, so the same research suggests that the following responses are the most effective. And for those of you involved in Safe Routes to School, I think you will recognize a lot of these. So they recommend educating parents, encouraging students to walk or bike to school, mapping out pedestrian routes, implementing walking school bus programs, and altering drop-off and pickup rules. So let's talk a little bit about what the problem with police involvement in Safe Routes to School is. So for the following slides, I have a number of examples on here, and I'm not going to go into all of them because we don't have enough time, but we have, I already see something in the chat, we have a link to the research. Everything is linked in the presentation, which we will be happy to share. So let's start. One of the first problems with police involvement in Safe Routes to School is that our streets, our neighborhoods, and our land use patterns are built upon decisions that harm and disadvantage low-income communities and communities of color. And there are entire doctoral level theses and books on this topic. And so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I'll give some highlights of what I'm talking about. So referring to the construction of the interstate highway system, intentionally destroying Black neighborhoods, industrial facilities and trash dumps sited near poor residential areas, the lack of supportive infrastructure for walking and biking in low-income communities due to lack of modernized zoning codes. And so enforcing traffic laws that are predicated upon racially unjust choices perpetuates those injustices. Another reason that police involvement in Safe Routes to School is problematic is that data bears out in communities all across the country that racial profiling is pervasive in the enforcement of traffic laws. In addition to the horrifying headlines that many of us are familiar with, where a traffic stop results in the death of a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person, there are also countless examples of racial profiling of people walking and biking. So just one example, it's the bottom one, the ProPublica on here, is in Jacksonville, Florida, where 29% of the city is Black and yet 78% of recipients of citations for walking in the roadway are Black. Another reason is that the efficacy of traffic enforcement is questionable. Several research studies show that traffic enforcement does not change behavior, and in studies where it does, the impact wears off in under 1 month, excuse me. So when we think about where are we directing our limited resources as safe routes to school programs, do we want to be investing those resources in something that has such limited effectiveness? Traffic enforcement is predicated on the idea that a penalty will deter unsafe behavior. Yet without income adjustment for fines and penalties, the deterrent effect is minimized on higher income, higher wealth people, yet disproportionately punitive for low income people who can spiral into debt, lose their license, and even become incarcerated as a result of a traffic fine. And finally, and most importantly, is that police involvement in safe routes to school does not make communities feel safer. At the core of what we've come to understand is that although many people were brought up to believe that police keep us safe, it's just not the case for a lot of people. And as a movement, we need to listen to each other's real lived experiences, trust them, and take action accordingly. As a movement that's focused on safety, health, and well-being of children, we need to listen when families in our communities are telling us that police involvement in safe routes to school make them feel less safe. So, of course, we need to know what alternatives to policing and safe routes to school are. I would say one of the things that we can do is investing in what we know works. So engineering our streets and roads to be slower and safer, teaching and encouraging kids and families to walk and bike, using league certified instructors and other trained educators to teach helmet fitting, bike riding skills, and traffic safety, investing in crossing guards and public safety officers for those folks who don't carry weapons, don't have arrest authority, and really are of the communities that they're serving. In some communities, there are attempts to do restorative justice, where school zone traffic violators complete community service related to school zone traffic, which, you know, as a busy parent, that would probably deter me rather than like, oh, just like write a check or pay my, you know, speeding ticket online. And then automated enforcement, I know we've gotten a lot of questions about that. So if using automated enforcement, ensure that the placement of cameras does not target low-income communities or communities of color, and reinvest in site-specific engineering improvements, provide income-adjusted fines. I was reading something yesterday from State Smart Transportation, SSTI, I forget exactly what it stands for, but there was something in there that really stuck out to me related to this, to these alternatives to policing and safe routes to school. So in Off the Rails, which is a master's thesis by Mayan Dembo that was featured in this report and recently on a NACDO webinar, the author found that it's a challenge, that the challenge to making, in this case, it was about public transit, but I think the lesson is relevant here too. The challenge to making public transit safe and civil while reducing the harms of armed policing is more a matter of budgeting and leadership rather than creativity and inspiration. So we have ideas. We know that getting enough money for engineering improvements and building that political will is tough, but it's doable. And we know what the answers are. It's a function of building our skills and capacity to do those things. So let's talk a little bit about why a lot of us are here. So our organization, the Safe Routes Partnership's decision to drop enforcement from the 6 E's of Safe Routes to School framework. So in June, we made the decision that we could no longer support enforcement as part of the 6 E's framework. And this is the result of many years of engagement and discussion with outside organizations and partners. And one thing that I think it's really important to note is that, I'm not going to go into the 6 E's, I think you all are familiar with them, but that the 6 E's are not, or 5 E's, are not codified into federal law. So when Safe Routes to School was created, the federal law, the federal program recognized the importance of both infrastructure and non-infrastructure and provided funding for both. But our decision to drop enforcement does not conflict with federal law or funding on comprehensive safe programming. So I'm not going to go into this whole timeline, but again, we're going to share these slides. I just think it's really important to note that this has been a learning and engagement process for us as a staff and as an organization. And while we made the announcement at a time of like national reckoning on the role of police in our country, this was not an impulse decision. And this is really the result of years of us trying to de-emphasize the role of police law enforcement in safe routes to school and really coming to a decision as an organization that we're not able to fix something so broken, and through investigating what role police play in a lot of safe routes to school programs, that it's not foundational to safe routes to school programs, and we can chart a path forward. And so I think it's also important to talk about, at the same time as dropping enforcement, we decided to add another E, which is engagement, to the safe routes to school framework. And as I shared, part of this is because our process of coming to the realization that we could no longer support enforcement as part of safe routes to school was the result of years of engaging with partners on the ground and in the field who were telling us enforcement involvement in safe routes to school makes communities feel unsafe. You should not have enforcement as part of your safe routes to school framework. I think some of the things that we learned from that we wanted to impart to other safe routes to school programs, is the true value that comes from engaging people and imbuing your program with diverse perspectives and opinions. And so I'll talk a little bit about why it's important to engage communities in building and growing and sustaining safe routes to school programs. And so one of those reasons is that one person or one group's lived experience is not universal. And I think this is what I was sort of talking about earlier. Like, I was raised as a white woman, a white Latina woman in this country, that, police are here to protect me. That doesn't mean that is the universal experience for everyone in this country. And it really took hearing from some of our partners that, like, hey, this isn't the case where we live, and like us needing to consider that as part of our policy and programmatic recommendations. We also know, and we've observed, that for programs to be effective and to be meaningful in a community, they really need to reflect the community members' needs, desires, and lived experiences. And these are not things that we can just Google. You can't just Google like, oh, what does my community prioritize? What do we think about this? We have to go out and talk to people, and we have to build trusting relationships. We also have seen over the years that engagement can really lead to shared program vision, greater buy-in, and support. And one of the things that I think is most exciting about this is that community identified solutions are innovative and creative, and they help us like grow and come up with like great, unique, really responsive, engaging programming for our communities. And so I really want to invite you to think about this the way that our organization is thinking about this, that this is an opportunity rather than a loss. So what do we stand to gain by removing enforcement and adding engagement to the 6 E's of safe routes to school? So we know, and all of you on this call, and the research tells us that safe routes to school works to get kids moving. It works to keep them safe from traffic violence. But what if it could work better? We've all seen the data on like how much we can increase our program or our mode share of people walking and biking by having safe routes to school programs. But pretty much everywhere across the country, there's still room to improve. And so what if this is a way to be including people who have been systematically excluded from safe routes to school as we know it? Through engagement, you have the opportunity to reach pockets of your school community that you haven't been able to involve in the past. You're going to hear me say this a lot more times, that diversity of opinions leads to creativity and innovation. So I also just want to acknowledge that change is hard. Like, I have worked to change public policy in probably 100 cities across the country. They're all different, they're all unique, but the one constant is that there is always a resistance to change factor. I just want to say, like, we as the national partnership, like, we hear you and we get it. Change is hard. And there are lots of reasons that change is hard. Sometimes it feels like a personal affront on, like, oh, but if we're going to do something differently, does that make my idea from all of these years bad? Like, no, not necessarily. We also know that, especially with something like police law enforcement, there are individual police officers that you work with who are probably great people. And the issue here is the system of policing as we know it in the United States. And so we understand and we recognize that making change at a systems level is really difficult. It's like turning a cruise ship. And we also recognize that with like tight funding and like none of us have enough staffing or money to do everything we want. And that idea of slowing down to like build relationships feels like it's going to slow down and derail all of your work. And there are lots of other reasons that we know that change is hard. Happy to talk more about them, but really just want to acknowledge that those feelings are very real, and yet encourage you, encourage your partners, encourage us to keep going. Because change can lead to great things. Accepting change and listening to other people's like out of the box ideas doesn't make your legacy bad, doesn't make all the great work that you've done to date bad. It's just a new way of doing things. We also think that one of the key points here is that lived experience is just as important as technical or professional experience, and we need to value that. And we really have an opportunity here to increase safety, increase rates of kids walking and biking, build social connections and cohesion. And I added this picture, which was from Blue Zones Hawaii, because I think it's one of these great examples of what happens when you engage community members. You get these beautiful traffic calming murals and wonderful opportunity to build intergenerational community. And this is really through like, okay, community engagement, and kind of give the process over to community members. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michelle to talk about some of the resources and next steps, and then pivot into our breakout groups. And thanks so much, everyone. Really look forward to talking more about this with you.
Thanks, Marisa. So here, when we distribute the slides, you'll see that we've linked to a number of the resources produced by our organization, as well as one outside organization. And these refer to a lot of the blog posts and reports and the work that we've done to date on related topics that Marisa mentioned in the timeline. We also have a few forthcoming resources where we have engineering toolkits in the works, and this will be providing engineering alternatives to some of the top traffic safety concerns that we hear about related to safe routes to school. We're also going to be developing a number of resources around community engagement and what deep, authentic community engagement looks like, including a training that's happening next week on the 20th, and definitely encourage you to register for that. So with that, we have some time for just a few Q&A, and really want to keep these to anything clarifying, any clarifying questions related to the presentation that Marisa gave. And I think that you'll have an opportunity to put more into like discussion and talking about different strategies in the breakout sessions. Okay, so I was just able to open up the chat box, and Marisa or Corey or any of the other staff, if there's any questions that you saw in here that are more like clarifying questions that we should answer right away.
I'm scrolling through right now, sorry. It's a lot in here, which is great.
Yeah, a lot of great dialogue happening between folks too, which is wonderful. So I know one of the questions was related to the citations and the information about the various studies that Marisa showed, and that all will be available in the slides. And I don't know that I see any other questions, a lot more conversation between folks. Okay, great. Maybe one, Marisa, if you want to touch on is the question about the role in shifting enforcement to automated enforcement.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kelly. I see that question. So this is one that I mentioned that I shared that timeline, and that over the years, our organization has really been thinking about is there a way to do enforcement more equitably? And one of the things that we did was we contracted with a lawyer to analyze how to make automated enforcement more equitable. And we do see opportunity. I think kind of the research bears out that it reduces racial bias in who gets stopped, provided that the location of the enforcement cameras is not based on race, ethnicity, or income. And sort of circling back to one of my earlier points about we have a legacy in this country of making racially motivated and racially harmful policy and funding choices about transportation infrastructure. And so by design, we have less great infrastructure for walking, biking, and faster roads through lower income and Black and brown communities. And so there is some, basically we just want there to be justification behind the selection of sites. And then we also think that the revenue that's generated should go into ideally site-specific improvements. And so using the revenue that's raised from that automated enforcement to improve that specific intersection. If it's so unsafe, use this to make it safer. We know that there are civil liberties questions. The ACLU has flagged the misuse of these data gathered from the automated enforcement to then conduct more racially motivated traffic stops or just enforcement. And so we think that there are several things that could be put into place, but we do see promise in the fact that there is a reduction in racial profiling and racial bias with the use of automated cameras, automated traffic enforcement.
Thanks, Marisa.